The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic. Hello and welcome to And Colossally That's History. I'm Matt Bishop.
And I'm Richard Williams. And on today's show, we're taking a left turn.
Well, several left turns actually, Richard, because we're going to be chatting about the Indy 500, the Indianapolis 500, the so-called greatest spectacle in racing.
So let's paint a picture, shall we? It's 4 a.m. on race day. It's 1993, the year Nigel Mansell first went to Indy. And I'm in my motel room in downtown Indianapolis, in time to get to the Speedway by 5, an hour before an aerial bomb, a sort of flare with a bang, signals the opening of the gates. I've got a pass that gets me in early, so I'm one of the first on the premises, even before the gangs of cleaners turn up to make sure everything's spick and span. Somehow, I get to park my rental car down by the old snake pit, the infield at Turn 1, notoriously the site of all sorts of all-American debauchery during the race weekend. And then I watch the sun come up over Gasoline Alley, as the garages are known, and the first of 400,000 ticket holders start to stream in. Over the next 6 hours, I see the whole Indy 500 pre-race pageantry. The parade of the racer's honorary Grand Marshal, the great basketball player Larry Bird on this occasion, and the 500 Festival Queen and her princesses. Another parade, this time of the official pace car, followed by the introduction of the drivers, each in an open-top car. The massed ranks of the Purdue University All-American Marching Band playing On the Banks of the Wabash as the cars are wheeled onto the grid, just as they've done since 1919, apparently. There's a solemn invocation by the Archbishop of Indianapolis. The playing of taps or the last post, since this is Memorial Day weekend, the US version of Remembrance Day, and a flypast of F-16 fast jets with one space purposely left, the missing man formation. And the final elements of the ritual, Florence Henderson singing The Star-Spangled Banner, Jim Nabors singing Back Home Again in Indiana with the Purdue Band. Nabors is dead now, but he did it almost every year from 1972 to 2014. And then the famous instruction. Ladies and gentlemen, start your engines. Modified when Janet Guthrie broke the gender barrier in 1977, and on this day recognising the presence on the grid of Lynn St. James. And if that doesn't get your spine tingling, wait for the sight and sound of 33 cars on the parade laps. 11 rows, running 3 abreast, in perfect formation behind the pace car. The ominous drone of thousands and thousands of horsepower being reined in as the sense of anticipation rises. And by the time the honorary starter waves the green flag, it's almost unbearable, and it's something I wouldn't have missed for the world.
Wow, Richard, a really evocative anecdote, that one. And we're going to hear more about your trips to Indianapolis later on. But everything you've just said feels very familiar to me because I too have been to the Indy 500. A wonderful experience. I went there later than you. I went there in 2017 with Fernando Alonso when he raced in what we at McLaren referred to as a McLaren, well, or at least a McLaren entry. It was a bit of a stretch, to be honest, because in truth it was a papaya-painted, orange-painted Dallara Honda run by the Andretti team, and it therefore had almost nothing to do with McLaren, but hey, same difference. Anyway, the Indy 500 really is the most wonderful spectacle, and I'm going to be speaking about my experiences of it with Fernando a little later on, because this episode is all about European incursions into and at the great American race, because European drivers and manufacturers have had an on-off love-hate relationship with the Indy 500, haven't they, Richard?
Yes, they have indeed. The event's largely been dominated by American drivers and historically by American cars and engines down the years. But there have been some fascinating European attempts at the 500, starting in the very earliest days. And we're going to focus on some of those stories in this episode.
We are indeed. So I suppose a good place to start would be with a brief history of oval racing, because as a form of motor racing, it was something that took particular hold in the United States, and for good reason.
Yes, the origin of oval racetracks was in horse racing, or more specifically harness racing, known in Europe as trotting, which probably goes all the way back to chariot racing at the Circus Maximus in ancient Rome and Ben-Hur. In the USA, in the 19th century, harness racing usually took place on 1-mile dirt oval tracks. Some of our listeners might have heard of the Milwaukee Mile, which is the world's oldest oval racetrack, and it was originally a venue for horses. I guess it's not too unlike how dog tracks are commonly used in this country for stock car racing and speedway. It's interesting because in Europe, early motor racing took place on public roads, and you had those great city-to-city races, Paris to Madrid and so on, and then round towns like Dieppe. But in America, there seemed much less appetite for that sort of thing, especially as the wide availability of horse racing tracks at state and county fairgrounds made great places for auto racing.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, isn't it? What is often regarded as the first ever Grand Prix, the 1906 French Grand Prix, was at Le Mans, but it wasn't at Le Mans in the sense that we mean that. It was a 60-something mile circuit, wasn't it?
From village to village,
yes.
Well outside Le Mans, in fact, yes, on narrow public roads.
Exactly. And by the way, I do commend you so early in our episode to mention greyhound racing and the Circus Maximus within a minute of each mention. Anyway, going back to the subject, I believe the first automobile race or horseless carriage race, in order to keep your Circus Maximus theme going, on an oval actually took place in 1896, so 10 years before the very first Grand Prix, at the Rhode Island State Fair. And one of the benefits of staging a race on an oval designed for horse racing is that unlike a race on public roads, as we've described, it's an enclosed environment. So you can charge spectators to watch.
Very important, particularly to Americans.
Then and now. And that's one of the reasons why racing in America became professional so quickly. Now, talking of the Rhode Island State Fair, which you mentioned earlier, and 1-mile dirt oval tracks, permit me a little digression, if you will. In the year 2000, which was when a bastardized version of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway first hosted the United States Grand Prix, I remember going with our mutual friend, the great journalist Nigel Roebuck, on the Friday evening before the Grand Prix to the Hoosier 100 at the Indiana State Fair, which was a small oval race for midget dirt cars. It was held on the same weekend as the Grand Prix because it had been cancelled owing to heavy rain on the date it was supposed to have been run, which was, I think, in late May. Anyway, I absolutely loved it. But I digress. I should point out that while we often tend to think of oval racing as uniquely American, and quite understandably so, the first purpose-built banked oval track in the world, actually the first, if I'm not mistaken, the first purpose-built motor racing circuit full stop, was in Europe, here in the UK, Brooklands.
Yeah, it was indeed. Brooklands was built in 1907 in the leafy Surrey stockbroker belt as the brainchild of Hugh Fortescue Lock King, a British entrepreneur who decided that Britain needed to have its own motor testing track in order for the British car industry to be able to compete with manufacturers from Europe. And actually, Brooklands was the inspiration for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Carl G. Fisher, an Indianapolis entrepreneur who'd made millions through the manufacture of car headlights in the early 20th century, and also ran what's believed to have been America's first car dealership, the first of quite a few, visited Brooklands in 1907 and went away with plans to build the world's greatest racetrack back in Indianapolis, which is where a lot of motor manufacturing was going on at the time. So, like Lock King in the UK, Fisher saw Indy as a place to give manufacturers a chance to test cars at sustained high speeds and give drivers a chance to learn their limits, both of which, well, I think you can say were achieved over
Absolutely
the years.
were.
And he also saw the value of ovals as better for spectators than road courses, as they'd get to see more of the cars.
Which makes total sense. Mm-hmm. And the track he conceived back then has remained, more or less unchanged. It's still a 2.5-mile rectangular or almost rectangular oval, although the track surface is a lot smoother today than it was back then. It was gravel to kick off, wasn't it?
Yes, they started laying the track down for the first time in March 1909. And actually it held its first race less than 6 months later. The original surface was what they call gravel and tar, sort of layers of hard-packed stones mixed with tar and sealed down. But the problem with that was that the surface quickly got rutted, and you had the danger then of stones and tar and all sorts of things being kicked up.
Yeah. So just as with early racing in Europe, the whole business, let's be honest about it, was incredibly dangerous.
Yep, that's exactly what happened at Le Mans, for instance, a very unstable surface, and eventually they got round to sealing it and making it a bit more stable.
Absolutely. So this has been a universal safety issue of racing over the past 100 and something years, really. So it was very dangerous in those days, which nobody's surprised to hear, that oval racing was dangerous 115 years ago. Guess what? Nobody's surprised to hear that. And in that first car meeting you mentioned, Richard, in August 1909, several drivers, riding mechanics, because don't forget there were always riding mechanics, and spectators were killed. And the American Automobile Association, which oversaw it all, naturally enough demanded improvements. And that's when Fisher and his partners settled on paving the entire circuit with bricks. I believe 3.2 million of them, if I'm not mistaken, giving, of course, the circuit its famous nickname, which survives to this day, the Brickyard.
And, of course, a yard of those very bricks remains exposed at the finish line today, all the way across the track, just a yard. And if you're in the grandstand near there or in the pits near the finish line, you hear the slap from the tyres as the cars go over them. And actually, they were asphalting the track starting in the 1930s. When they did it, they left the original bricks underneath as a foundation. So they're still there, and it still really is the Brickyard.
It absolutely is. And although we won't spend all of this podcast talking about individual races, individual Indy 500s, I think it's worth mentioning the first Indy 500 because it's very evocative, particularly evocative of that particular era of racing. So it was held on the 30th of May 1911. There were 40 starters and 85,000 spectators, apparently, and they saw the first ever mass rolling start, because rolling starts are still used in IndyCar racing today, whereas obviously in Europe we've always had standing starts, so that's one of the big differences in racing on both sides of the pond then and now. Anyway, tragically, only 12 laps had elapsed, just 12 laps, before the first Indy 500 death took place. I feel I'm focusing on death a bit and maybe a bit too morbid, but I'm afraid it is an unavoidable subject when we're talking about racing more than 100 years ago. But it wasn't a driver, because what happened was one of the front wheels came off the car that Arthur Greiner was driving. So he was flung out of his Amplex car. Amplex, that's a name to conjure with. I think they went out of business in, around 1915. So forgiven for not having heard of Amplex, if anyone's listening that hasn't. Anyway, he was flung out of his Amplex car, still clutching its steering wheel, and he suffered a broken arm. Bad, but not too bad. But his riding mechanic, Sam Dixon, was crushed under the car. And I'd just like to read you this little passage from the New York Times report of the race to give you a sense of the atmosphere and, if I could call it, the truly rabid fascination of the spectators there at that time. It goes as follows. The crowd was too big to be controlled by a company of militia, and hundreds of special policemen were posted about the grounds. The spectators swarmed across the infield when Dixon was killed and pressed close about his body and that of the unconscious Greiner. Soldiers had to club their guns to clear a space for the surgeons when the ambulance arrived. Just imagine that, Richard. Just imagine. It sounds more like the Wild West, or perhaps the Wild Midwest, we could call it, than a race report. And sadly, Arthur Greiner never got over it. He ended up in what Americans then called a sanitarium, a mental hospital, what we would now call a mental hospital, and he died in that sanitarium in Milwaukee 6 years later after a nervous breakdown. Anyway, back to Indy 1911. The spectators' fascination, well, some of the spectators, obviously, not all of them, but their fascination was so morbid that they risked their own lives by running across the track to stare at close quarters at the victims of that terrible crash. Yet the race went on. The show went on, while the drivers swerved around the track invaders as they crossed the track. I mean, it really was the Wild Midwest, wasn't it? Anyway, the race was won, somewhat controversially, by Ray Haroon, driving his famous Marmon Wasp, which those who've been to the Goodwood Revival or Festival of Speed over the years may be familiar with. I say controversially because there was some dispute as to whether he was in fact in the lead at the end, at the finish. Anyway, you know I love my Anorak facts, Richard. I often tweet about Anorak facts. And here's one for you. Every driver in the race, except Haroon, had a riding mechanic alongside him. And his job was not only to work on the car, but also to act as a spotter. Haroon didn't feel he needed one, because he was using a newfangled invention. Guess what it was? A rear-view mirror. I think it's probably an exaggeration to say that he invented that, but it was certainly the first time it ever been used on a racing car.
And on that utterly golden Anorak fact from Matt, it feels like a good time to take our first break.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
So, In part 1, we gave you a brief history of oval racing and the Indy 500 itself. But let's get on to talking about European incursions into the Indy 500, because they started early, didn't they, Richard?
Yeah, they did. And no doubt the Europeans were attracted by the purse on offer. For the first Indy 500 in 1911, the total purse was $25,000, which was equivalent, so they say, to roughly 40 kilos of pure gold.
Wow.
The purse was doubled for the following year, and it's been going up ever since, always well ahead of Grand Prix prize money. Today it's $17 million, of which the winner takes about $4 million. There were some European-built cars used in that very first race, but one of the first European marques to come across with more of a bona fide effort, if you like, was the French manufacturer Peugeot in 1913. They came with their L76 Grand Prix car, which had turned in some impressive victories in Grand Prix in Europe. And that was thanks in no small part to its revolutionary four-cylinder engine with double overhead cams and 4 valves per cylinder, which basically set the pattern for the modern combustion engine and racing engines in general for the rest of the 20th century. Peugeot entered 2 cars for the 1913 race, one for Jules Gou, who'd actually helped design the car, and one for Paolo Zuccarelli. Zuccarelli retired from the race, but Gou went on to become the first European winner, claiming victory by 13 minutes and 8 seconds, which is still the biggest winning margin in Indy 500 history.
A rout by Gou.
Très bien. Bien joué. But what's even more remarkable about this victory is that by the time he reached the checkered flag, press reports at the time suggested that he may have drunk as much as 6 bottles of wine during the race. In a race report of the time in the local paper, the Indianapolis Star, Gou was quoted as saying at his first pit stop, "Donnez-moi une bouteille de vin ou je suis fini," which roughly translates into, "Give me a bottle of wine or I'm done for."
I think most people would have been done for by the volume of wine, let alone the absence of it.
Not our Jules. So, again, according to the paper, some pitmen were sent to the grandstand in search of the necessary bottle of liquid encouragement. And one of them happened on a party from Pittsburgh, noted centre of wine culture,
of course,
who'd placed a number of bets on Gou. They came to the rescue and sent the pitman back with half a bottle of vintage Plonk.
Chateau Pittsburgh.
No doubt. And quoting directly from the paper now, Jules saw him coming and, snatching a bottle from him as he reached the track, cracked the neck of the bottle on the retaining wall and permitted the contents to trickle down his throat, wetting his tonsils as it went. Then back into his seat he leapt, and from that time on, the outcome of the great motor struggle was little in doubt. What a story.
What an incredible story. Thank you, Richard. And actually, that was the first, another Anorak fact here, that was the first of 4 straight victories for European machines before World War I, of course, caused a break. A 2-year break only, though, because war was declared in 1914, and the Indy 500 was run that year, 1914, and in 1915, and in 1916 too, but not in 1917 or 1918. Anyway, going back to 1914, when incidentally alcoholic consumption was banned during the race, poor old Gou, René Thomas won in a Delage. Then in 1915, Ralph de Palma won in a 4.5-litre Mercedes Grand Prix car. Then Peugeot won again in 1916 with Dario Resta driving. Resta was born in Italy, at Faenza, by the way, near Imola, but he moved to Britain with his family at the age of 2, and sadly he was later killed at Brooklands attempting to break the land speed record. And permit me another little digression. The name Dario Resta always reminds me of a mix of 2 other British racing drivers of Italian descent, Dario Franchitti and Paul di Resta.
Dario Franchitti, who later became part of the Indy story.
Absolutely did. But I am digressing again.
I suppose the next European achievement of note was that of Maserati, who won back-to-back Indy 500s in 1939 and 1940 with the American racer Wilbur Shaw at the wheel. Shaw had actually won in 1937 at the wheel of his own Shaw-Gilmore Special, accompanied by one Jigger Johnson. In the last year, riding mechanics were used.
Nicknames were great in those days. American nicknames, fantastic.
Fabulous. Jigger Johnson.
I know,
yeah.
I know.
Who wouldn't win with him sitting in your passenger seat? Maserati's 2 wins were really important to the company because they'd been in financial difficulties, as Maserati has been so often throughout its history. And the Maserati brothers were having to sell their shares to another family, the Orsis, in 1937 in order to stay afloat. But with a bit more stability, thanks to the Orsis, Ernesto Maserati was able to design the beautiful 8CTF, possibly, well, in my view anyway, the prettiest car ever to win the 500. But then I think front-engine cars are prettier than rear-engine cars in all eras.
I think I would probably have a soft spot for the Indy Roadsters of the 50s.
Oh, absolutely.
Gorgeous.
Yeah, we'll come back to them.
Yeah.
Anyway, for the 500, the Maserati was rechristened the Boyle Special because it had been bought for Wilbur Shaw to drive by a man called Mike Boyle, a racing enthusiast who'd actually made his fortune from running the Electrical Workers' Trade Union in Chicago. The way one did back then.
Yeah.
And so it was entered as the Boyle Special. And as I said, Shaw took it to victory in both 1939 and 1940 and was actually on course for a historic hat-trick in 1941 when a late puncture cost him the win. Very sad.
Yeah.
But at a time when Maserati was getting thrashed in Grand Prix racing by Mercedes and Auto Union, the German state teams, these victories really helped them to build their reputation in the United States.
That's a very good point. Absolutely, because, the Silver Arrows were destroying them really in Europe at that time.
In Grand Prix racing.
They were, yes. Yep. So that's Maserati. But we should probably talk now about 2 of Maserati's big rivals on the Grand Prix scene, Mercedes and Ferrari. Now, Mercedes first, let's say. A number of Mercedes Grand Prix cars took part in the Indy 500. We've already mentioned Ralph de Palma's winning car in 1915. But they never actually sent a factory team to the race, although there are reports that they were extremely close to doing so, especially with the W154 in 1938. But fascinatingly, one of those, truly magnificent W154 Mercs, which we spoke about actually on our earlier episode, the one when we were talking about how the Nazis weaponized motor racing in the 1930s. One of those W154 Mercs did end up racing in the Indy 500, believe it or not, because after the Second World War, W154 chassis number 9, to be precise, was discovered in Czechoslovakia, present-day Czech Republic, where it had been hidden during the war, hidden for safekeeping.
They'd hidden them all over the place, haven't they? I
absolutely.
think Alfred Neubauer, the team manager, made sure that they were put in mine shafts and all sorts of things.
Anywhere where they could be not found and destroyed or nicked, really. Yeah. Anyway, that car ended up in the hands of Don Lee, an American who entered the car in the 1947 Indy 500 for Duke Nalon, who was nicknamed the Iron Duke. Nicknames again. Who wouldn't want to be to ask a man called the Iron Duke to race his car? Anyway, according to Nalon, the Iron Duke, the back seat was marked with the words Von Brauchitsch, which gives you an idea of the provenance of the car, because, of course, Manfred von Brauchitsch would have raced it in Europe in the 1930s. Nalon said of that car, by the way, and I quote, "It was the most comfortable race car I ever drove." Anyway, a blown piston meant he failed to finish the race, so sad end, or reasonably sad end to that story. The car was actually entered to race in the Indy 500 in 1948 as well for Chet Miller, but he too failed to finish. And actually in 1949, the year after that, the great Mercedes team boss, Alfred Neubauer, turned up at Indy because he wanted to investigate the feasibility of a works Merc entry for 1951, but that never happened. It never came to pass. So Mercedes finally scored, I think we'd have to say, a memorable Indy 500 victory in 1994, so quite a long time later, having created with Ilmor, an incredible pushrod V8, which they nicknamed the Beast. We're doing well with nicknames at the moment, I have to notice. Anyway, nicknamed the Beast, which powered Alonso Jr. to victory in a Penske Merc. It was a Penske chassis, but a Merc V8. But that's about as close to a works Merc effort as there's ever been. But anyway, I'm jumping forward a bit, Richard, because it's your turn to talk about Ferrari, and Ferrari attempted the Indy 500 in the 1950s, didn't they?
Yes, they did in 1952, and that was an interesting year because the Formula One World Championship, which had been inaugurated in 1950, was suddenly being run to Formula 2 regulations, which put the maximum capacity of engines at 2 litres. Now, the Indianapolis 500, as one of the world's greatest races, was actually part of the World Championship Series from 1950 to 1960, but it was still run to its own regulations. So Ferrari were able to enter the race with a version of their 1951 spec 4.5-litre Grand Prix car, the mighty 375 Indianapolis.
Right.
Enzo Ferrari had hoped that winning the race would help crack the American road car market, so he decided not to enter his star driver Alberto Ascari in the Monaco Grand Prix run for sports cars that year, or the season-opening Swiss Grand Prix, and instead he sent him to take on the full might of the Americans at Indianapolis, alone.
Do you think that Enzo Ferrari's motivation might partly have been a response to, albeit a belated one, to Maserati's success in the late 30s?
Oh, very likely, because there was such a terrific rivalry. They were both based in the same town.
Yeah. And he'd seen what Maserati had done to promote itself in the States.
Sure. So that was the decision for him. And understandably, when it got to Indianapolis, it was the source of enormous attention. But in the end, it proved a bit of a damp squib. Ascari could only qualify 19th fastest and only lasted 40 laps of the race when a hub went on one of the wheels and the wheel collapsed. So Indianapolis went down as the only World Championship race in 1952 that Ascari entered and didn't win, because he won 6 others and the world title in the all-conquering 2-litre Ferrari 500. Ferrari almost came back to Indianapolis in 1986 when Enzo got his designer Gustav Brunner to draw up a special car for the 500. But sadly, the Ferrari 637 never got out of Maranello. I don't know if you've been to the museum there, Matt.
I have.
But that aborted Indy car is a star exhibit there.
It really is. Yeah. It's such a shame in some ways that it
never... a great shame, but actually it did its job, because what it really was a bluff to frighten the FIA, who were trying to change the Formula One engine regulations, and so wanted to put pressure on them not to. So the threat of giving up Formula One and going to race in America was enough to do the trick.
Which threat that Ferrari has made on a serial basis for the past half-century.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I suppose we should also mention that another Italian manufacturer, Dallara, has won 17 of the last 22 Indy 500s, which isn't entirely surprising.
Not that surprising.
Not really, because they've been the sole chassis supplier to the IndyCar series since 2007. Their first winner was Eddie Cheever in 1998, fondly remembered by F1 fans.
Yep.
And the most recent...
Great helmet design.
One of the great helmets in the days when you could still recognise a driver by their helmet.
Yes, indeed.
And the most recent of Dallara's wins was last year with Joseph Newgarden. And actually since 2012... the cars have been made not in Italy, but at Dallara factory, specially built close to the Speedway.
How about that? Anyway, let's go back to the Ascari era, because he wasn't the only 1950s Formula One world champion to have a go at the Indy 500, was he? I mean, let's talk about the greatest, or one of the candidates for the greatest of all time, Juan Manuel Fangio. Now, he'd just won his 5th and final Formula One World Championship when he gave the Indy 500 a go in 1958. He'd obviously won it in 1957, his 5th World Championship. And he was offered $20,000, which must have been an absolute fortune in those days. Yeah. $20,000 to qualify a Curtis Offenhauser by the car's owner, George Walther Jr. Now, let me just say something about Offenhauser, because I've always thought the name Offenhauser was wonderfully glam, and perhaps even more glam somehow when abbreviated to Offie. I love the name Offie. The Offie was a big, old 4-cylinder lump of an engine, and it dominated American open-wheel racing for, wait for it, more than 50 years. 50 years. It started life, actually, in the 1930s as a marine engine, an engine for boats, I mean. And all told, Offie-powered cars won the Indy 500 27 times.
That's amazing, isn't it? 50 years. That makes the Cosworth DFV look like a sort of,
a blip.
Yeah, exactly.
A little blip. No, massively impressive. And in the end, I mean, it kept being developed. This is a 4-cylinder engine, remember. In the end, the Offie acquired a turbo, and in that spec, it was pumping out more than 1,000 brake horsepower. And the last time an Offie-powered car was raced in an American open-wheel racing was in 1982, all the way on to 1982. And it actually won an open-wheel race as late as 1978. And that was at Trenton, New Jersey. And the driver was Gordon Johncock. And the car was a Wildcat.
And the engine would have been behind the driver in that one.
But by that time. And I can hardly imagine a more wonderfully American-sounding driver circuit car engine combo than Gordon Johncock, Trenton, New Jersey, Wildcat Offie. Forgive my bad American accent, but I couldn't say it in my RP English, could I? Anyway, let's go back to Fangio and 1958. His Curtis Offenhauser, Curtis Offie, proved a bit of a dud. He didn't make it into the race, actually. But by that stage, he was 47 years old, and really very close to the end of his brilliant career. In fact, only 6 weeks later, I think it was, at Reims, he got out of his Maserati after finishing 4th in the French Grand Prix, and said, "It is finished." But to be fair to the maestro, he was still the best classified Maserati driver in that race, with no fewer than 6 Maseratis classified behind him. So I think it was his high standards, really, and his standards were very high.
They were the highest. We didn't see bona fide F1 superstars back at Indianapolis until 1961. By which time the 500 had been taken off the F1 World Championship calendar, which is a bit of a shame, really, because it was always rather an amusing anomaly to have. You look at the end of the season, you'd look at the standings, and you'd have this bunch of American drivers all with one, points from one race to their name.
And you suddenly find that, 6th was Roger Ward.
Yep.
Or something like that.
Yep. And Troy Ruttman,
ahead of Castellotti. And you think, how? Why did that happen?
Anyway, 1961 was when John Cooper entered one of his F1 Cooper climaxes for Jack Brabham, the reigning world champion. It was the first proper car at Indy with its engine behind the driver, and it was about half the size of the conventional front-engined Indy Roadsters. So the locals saw it as a bit of a joke.
Yeah.
Anyway, until Brabham qualified 13th and finished 9th on the same lap as A.J. Foyt's winning Travis Offie. And then Colin Chapman, the Lotus boss and a famous innovator, was attracted to Indy because of the huge prize money.
Chapman liked a bit of money, didn't he?
I believe so, yes. Yeah. And obviously the money was far bigger than most European races. So he went over for the first time in 1963 with 2 specially built cars for Jim Clark, his number 1 driver in F1, and Dan Gurney, who, when he raced against Clark in F1, some people thought was Jim's only real rival.
Didn't Clark say, I think, wasn't the quote, "He is the only driver I ever really feared"?
Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah.
Great driver. So pretty good to have them in the same team.
Unbelievable.
Clark finished second and Gurney was seventh. And this is one of those occasions when there was some dispute about the winner of the Indianapolis 500, as there had been in the very first race.
Yeah.
And Clark would have won had the stewards not been talked into not showing the black flag for the winner, Parnelli Jones, an All-American boy, whose All-American roadster was leaking All-American oil from a cracked tank in the closing stages. And for Jim, getting the Rookie of the Year award wasn't really much consolation for a man on the way to his first World Championship.
I bet it wasn't, but they were back next year, the following year, with a new car for Clark and the same old one for an American driver, Bobby Marshman. They qualified first and second, and both of them led. Both of them led the race before Clark went out with a broken suspension, caused by a burst tyre, apparently, and Marshman went off the track and lost a lot of oil. There had been a 7-car crash in which the 1961 winner, Eddie Sachs, and the sports car ace, Dave McDonald, had both been killed. It was a horrible race. And in the end, A.J. Foyt scored the last Indy 500 victory for a front-engined roadster. I mean, it should have been a wonderful occasion because great driver, great car, great era of cars, as I say. I love those 50s and 60s Indy roadsters. But, of course, it wasn't because of the tragedies. And his car, the winning car, was a Watson Offie. Actually, you can see it. You talked about museums, the Ferrari Museum. You can see that Watson Offie at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum, and it's still in the condition in which it finished the race. It looks fantastic.
Yeah, I've got a friend who says that the music you hear between the ages of 12 and 25 is what stays with you forever. And it's a bit like that with cars, except I think probably the age span is 5 and 15. From dinky toys to when you first really fall in and see your first races. And those roadsters, to me, were what Indy was about. Offset roadsters, so they only really went round left-hand turns. They were built specifically to turn left and not right.
Yeah, single-seater, but the driver on one side.
Exactly, everything offset, suspension and everything.
And beautiful liveries.
Wonderful, and great names, the Dean Van Lines Special, and the John Zink Leader Card Special.
Lots of specials.
Lots of specials.
And always with hyphen offie at the end.
Exactly.
Anyway,
where were we?
We were with Clark and Chapman in the 60s, and Clark and Chapman got their revenge in 1965 when Clark skipped the Monaco Grand Prix, as Fernando Alonso would many years later, but we'll come to that. So he skipped the Monaco Grand Prix, which was the same weekend, and he won the Indy 500, in fine style, because he led 190 of the 200 laps, and of the 33 cars in the field, only 6 by that point were old-style, beautiful roadsters, which does show you, to be fair, how quickly the Americans had, does this sound jingoistic, had submitted to the British invasion, just perhaps as the Beatles and the Stones had been taking over the US charts. But this is your area.
And Freddie and the Dreamers and Jerry and the Pacemakers, let us not forget.
How dare I not think of them?
I don't know who was the Freddie and the Dreamers of European Grand Prix racing. But
it's another podcast. Yeah. Anyway, there had been a bit of a stir caused when Chapman had brought in the famous 2-man Wood Brothers pit crew from NASCAR to work on Clark's fuel and tyre stops. But it was over-engineering or over-egging the pudding, really, because they were completely unemployed, or underemployed, I should say, unemployed during the race because Clark's Lotus stopped only twice for fuel, whereas obviously roadsters would stop more often, and it did the whole race on the same set of tyres. So Clark won by a mile, and his unchallenged win made him the first non-US-born winner since Gaston Chevrolet in 1920, although Gaston Chevrolet had become an American citizen by then. I think that qualifies as an anorak fact, Richard, don't you?
Oh, a very special one indeed, Matt. And that achievement also put Clark on the cover of Time magazine with the headline, "The Quickest Man on Wheels." Now, people today might not understand the significance of the cover of Time magazine, but if you got that, it meant you were a world figure.
It was a biggie.
I remember when Janis Joplin was due to be on the cover in the 1960s, such a big thing. And then Dwight Eisenhower, the former president, died, and they replaced her on the cover with him. And her great quote was, 14 heart attacks, and he has to die in my week. So that's what the cover of Time magazine went. But Jim was out of luck again a year later, or was he? To this day,
well, it's a big question, isn't it?
It is, because to this day no one seems completely sure whether Graham Hill really won the 1966 race in one of John Mecom's Lola Fords, becoming the first Englishman to win the race exactly 8 weeks before England won the Football World Cup at Wembley. Right at the start in 1966, there was an 11-car crash in which, amazingly, the only injury was suffered by A.J. Foyt, who damaged his hand while climbing up the safety fence in order to try and get away from any fires that might break out.
Goodness me.
Clark would have won if he hadn't spun twice. Jackie Stewart and Graham Hill were both rookies, and Jackie led until his oil pressure disappeared with 10 laps to go, handing Graham the win. But did it?
Well, did it? Carry on.
The official lap counting was still done manually in those days, and Clark's crew believed that his laps had been miscounted when he made 2 brief stops to check for damage after the spins. And some believed that Gordon Johncock, who was placed 4th, was the real winner. He'd started from the pit lane after repair to the damage from the crash at the start, and his first lap wasn't counted by the officials, and he'd finished on the same lap as the winner. So the record books say that Graham was the winner, and that he's therefore the only man in history to win the unofficial Triple Crown of the Indy 500, the Monaco Grand Prix, and the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And the record books are never wrong, are they, Matt?
Indeed they aren't, unless they are. By the way, Damon Hill listens to our podcast, and I hope that Damon, if you're listening, I hope you're not upset to hear us not pouring scorn, but casting doubt on your father's great achievement. You can reply on Twitter, can't you?
It's in the record books.
Anyway, let's hope Gordon Johncock, because of course Graham Hill's not alive, very sadly, but let's hope Gordon Johncock doesn't get any Felipe Massa-inspired litigation ideas, eh? And that feels like a good time to go for another short break. So our waltz down memory lane, or should that be victory lane, or perhaps gasoline alley, has so far taken us up to the mid-1960s. But I want to fast forward a little now, so that we can talk about some of our own personal experiences of the Indy 500, which actually are relevant to our specific subject because they have coincided with other big moments for Europeans at Indy. As I've mentioned before on our podcast, I worked for McLaren as comms director, communications director, for many years, from 2008 to 2017, in fact. And McLaren is, of course, another European team with an incredible pedigree at the Indianapolis 500. McLaren cars were driven to victory in 3 times in the 70s, 1972, 1974 and 1976. To be fair, in 1972, the winner was Mark Donoghue in a Penske-entered and run McLaren Offie. And in 1974 and in 1976, it was a full works McLaren entry, a McLaren Offie again, driven by Lone Star JR, a.k.a. Johnny Rutherford. By the way, look, I love Johnny Rutherford. I absolutely love Johnny Rutherford. He was a 2-time Indy 500 winner, both times in McLarens, and then a 1-time winner, making 3 in total, in a Chaparral. What a beautiful car that Chaparral was, that yellow Pennzoil Chaparral.
Absolutely. Very elegant. Elegant. Yeah.
You know, the first really successful ground effect Indy car. Wonderful car. Anyway, I engaged him to be a McLaren brand ambassador for the 2017 Indy 500. Asked him, and obviously we paid him and, did a deal with him. Asked him to attend race day and also the whole week leading up to race day, so that we could trot him out for TV interviews and press interviews and the like, and sponsor stuff, so that Fernando Alonso could get on with trying to get used to a totally different discipline of racing, without being too distracted by media work, which Fernando's never that keen on. Modern Formula One drivers never really are, particularly if they're successful, which of course Fernando is, or has been. Although, of course, Fernando had to do a bit of it. Anyway, Johnny and I got to know each other quite well during that period, a wonderful privilege, and for me. And as I say, what a great guy he is. The word, which is often overused, but we're going to use it, and I think it's fair, is legend. Now, he was 80-odd then. I think he's 86 now, but he remembered everything. He's one of these guys. He remembered everything from his glorious career and that era, although he was incredibly humble about it. And here's the thing. I'd been hanging out with him in the Andretti hospitality unit because, of course, Andretti was running the car that we were at a stretch calling a McLaren. One afternoon on the days leading up to the race, I was hanging out having a coffee with Johnny Rutherford. And when we were joined by Mario Andretti and Nigel Roebuck. So I was sitting with Johnny Rutherford, Mario Andretti, and Nigel Roebuck. I have to say, I'm 61 now, so I know you're in your 70s, old boy, and Nigel is in his 70s, and Mario and Johnny are both in their 80s. But the idea of 12-year-old me reading Autosport, being able to sit and have a cup of coffee with Mario Andretti and Johnny Rutherford and Nigel Roebuck. It's quite extraordinary, still extraordinary to me.
And now you have to sit here and listen to me.
I do. But that's what I did when I was, the four of us in it. I didn't talk. I just listened. I just listened to Andretti, Rutherford and Roebuck talking. What a privilege. Just fantastic. And at one point, Lone Star JR, Johnny Rutherford, he popped away to make a coffee for himself, or popped to the loo. I don't know what he went away for. I can't remember now. And Mario said Rutherford was very, very quick, especially in qualifying. And then he said, maybe the quickest of my time when it came to really nailing a flat-out lap on a super speedway at knocking 200 miles an hour. Later, after Mario and Nigel had gone, I told Johnny what Mario had said about him. And in the loveliest way, he had a bit of a moment. He said, well, I never knew that Mario thought that about me. And there was a bit of a pause, and then he said, thank you for telling me that. It means a lot. Anyway, it's a bit of an aside, but I thought it's a nice story. Why was Fernando at Indy that year? Well, if you remember, the 2017 McLaren Formula One car was pretty poor, pretty dire, actually, and Fernando wasn't enjoying it at all. The beginning of that season, he DNF'd, did not finish, in Melbourne, Shanghai and Bahrain, 3 races on the spin, DNFs. Then he didn't even make it to the grid in Sochi. He raced at home in Spain, thank goodness, otherwise there probably would have been hell to pay. And he managed to finish 12th, nothing to write home about, and lapped twice by the winner, Lewis Hamilton, obviously for Merck, in his Merck. So by that time, we McLarenites were trying to think of things to amuse Fernando, because, racing that awful McLaren Honda certainly wasn't amusing him. So we let him skip Monaco to do the Indy 500 in true Jim Clark style.
And Ascari, yes.
And Ascari style, yes.
What champions do.
What champions do. Funny enough, there was an irony there, because that terrible McLaren Honda, the one place where we thought it might have been okay because it was so bad at high-speed circuits, was Monaco. So we actually missed probably the best point scoring or best result scoring chance. Anyway, it's what we did. And it became, of course, an enormous story, which was also part of our strategy because our sponsors weren't having a good time either. And we wanted to give our sponsors something to get excited about after such a dismal start to the year in Formula One. Now, another name here to conjure with, we hired Gilles de Ferran, a lovely, lovely, lovely man whom I think we all miss so very much, who died suddenly very recently, and a great guy. Anyway, we hired Gilles to coach Fernando on how to drive at Indy because Gilles was very, very good on, or had been very, very good on super speedways. And we hired him to coach Fernando on how to drive at Indy, and Gilles did a fantastic job. But to be fair, Fernando took to it like a duck to water anyway. And it was so good to see. You could really tell that after 2.5 years in dog-slow McLaren Hondas, because it hadn't just been 2017, but also 2016 and 2015 that his McLaren Hondas, our McLaren Hondas, had been so poor, he was suddenly coming alive. And he really thought he could win the Indy 500. He thought he could win the big race. And the Andretti team, you began to realise as the days went past, they thought so too. And he really could have won. He really could. He qualified in the middle of the second row, which means fifth. Very, very good qualifying. He led the race often. And in the fourth quarter, as they say, in the fourth quarter, obviously of the 200 laps, so after lap 150 onwards, he looked to be in really good shape. He was right up there with the leading bunch. Then, I remember it well, and I'll never forget it. On lap 179, with 21 laps to go, therefore, he was running seventh in an extremely tightly bunched leading group. We're not talking about seventh in a Grand Prix. Seventh at the Indy 500 means you're right in the leading bunch with a chance of winning. Every chance of being in the hunt for the win by the end. Then his Honda engine, yet again a Honda engine, gave up the ghost and he coasted to a stop on the infield just before turn one. And I'd actually watched some of the race up on a roof high on the infield at turn one. I don't think I've ever watched a motor race from a more spectacular vantage point, seeing the cars absolutely, streaming along the straight and diving into turn one. Absolutely fantastic. Cauldron of noise, wonderful speed. Anyway, by that time, fourth quarter, I'd walked back to the McLaren hospitality suite because I wanted to see the timing screens and data rather than just get the atmosphere. So I was sitting next to Lone Star JR, Johnny Rutherford, and Fernando stopped. I couldn't speak. We were all so gutted. And I just turned to look at Johnny. He just shrugged, he shook his head, and he drawled, "Dang, dang, dang."
You made that up.
I didn't. I remember him exactly saying that.
Do it again.
Dang, dang, dang.
Now I believe you.
Why would you ever forget that? It was an incredible moment. A legend. I love English, but American English is very special at times, isn't it? Absolutely fantastic. Anyway, Fernando tried the Indy 5. By the way, I will say, an Andretti car won the race. Takuma Sato won the race. So it was a funny feeling because the Andretti team were absolutely over the moon because they just won the Indy 500. We were absolutely gutted. Yeah. And they were this funny thing of saying, we're happy but bad luck.
How did Fernando feel?
He was pleased. Obviously, he was disappointed. But he was pleased to have... He knew he'd done a good job.
Well, he'd met the challenge, hadn't he?
He'd met the challenge. And there had been some naysayers and doubters. And he'd completely met the challenge. And everybody, whether it was Andretti or Rutherford or anyone else, they said, my God, he's done a good job.
Yeah, and it's not just learning to drive on ovals. It's all things about weight jacking and spotters and all that stuff, which is completely different.
Completely different. And it was all new to him.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying he would have won the race, but, he was in the leading group and he could have won the race. He could have been second, third, fourth, fifth or sixth. He could have been anything like that, but he did a fantastic job. Of course, he was disappointed not to have had the result, and he was frustrated with the engine failure with, 21 laps to go. But he knew he'd done a good job, and he'd enjoyed himself.
And he wasn't discouraged because he was back again a couple of years later.
Yeah, although not with very good results. He came back 2 years later in 2019 in a McLaren entered Dallara Chevy at that point. This is because McLaren had fallen out with Honda. So Honda said, no, we're not going to give you any engines. You'll have to go to Chevrolet, which then happened. But he failed to qualify. Very embarrassing. I was no longer working for the team, by the way, by that time. I left in 2017, quite soon after that famous Indianapolis race, anyway. And he went again in 2020, also in a McLaren entered Dallara Chevy. He did qualify this time, but he started 26th and finished 21st. And I think he remains, because he hasn't been back since, I think he remains the last active Formula One driver to attempt the Indy 500. Anyway, Richard, as you remembered earlier, your trips to Indy, which were earlier than mine in 1993 and 1994, also coincided with near misses for a Formula One world champion of European origin, if we could call him that, Birmingham origin.
Yeah, and of course that's why I was there, because after winning the F1 World Championship in 1992, Nigel got an offer to...
We're talking about Nigel Mansell, just by the way, yes.
Nigel Mansell got an offer to go to America and race Indy cars in 93 for the Newman-Haas team, whose figurehead was Paul Newman, the Hollywood star.
Yeah.
And they had very good cars, good Lolas, Lola Fords, and it was a good team, top team. His teammate would be Mario Andretti.
Exactly.
So it was going to be competitive anyway. And, to his great credit, he took up the challenge.
Great looking car, by the way.
Oh, beautiful cars. But that generation of rear-engined Indy cars, they were all good looking.
Much better than now in terms of aesthetics.
Yeah, they were. Anyway, so he went, and he had a very good season. I mean, he won races and he won the championship, which for a rookie, never raced ovals before, was totally brilliant.
Yes.
Now, of course, had he won at Indianapolis, that would have dwarfed everything else. That would have been far greater than winning the series title. And he got. I mean,
it's a bit like winning Le Mans is more important than winning the World Endurance Championship.
Oh, completely, exactly the same.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Commercially and into every kind of prestige. So anyway, he got to Indy and he qualified in the middle of the third row, 8th, which was pretty good. And he did well in the race. He kind of moved up slowly as the pit stops took place and all that. And eventually, with not long to go, with about 20 laps to go, he was in the lead and looking good.
Yeah.
Ahead of two former winners, Emerson Fittipaldi and Arie Luyendyk. But on lap 182 out of 200, Lynn St. James, I think she ran out of petrol anyway, and the car stopped, so the yellow flag came out. And it stayed out for a few laps while they got St. James's car out of the way. The green flag came out again, restart, but they'd all bunched up, inevitably. So Emo and Luyendyk were on Nigel's tail, and whoosh, when the green flag came out, they were both past him, because he had no experience of restarts in oval racing, which are a very different thing. And these two guys had been doing it.
Old hands.
Exactly, they'd been doing it for years. So he was very disconcerted by that. And there he was suddenly in third place. And while he was chasing them, he actually hit the wall at one point with both right side wheels. He really gave it a thump, and you might have expected to do some damage. But amazingly, it didn't, and he managed to carry on. And there was another yellow flag period before the finish, but he couldn't make anything of that. So he came third, which was actually pretty dang good.
Yes, pretty dang good.
But not what he, or I have to say, Fleet Street was looking for. The half of Fleet Street had descended on Indianapolis that week, including me, I have to say, in the hope of a win.
And MO won, did he not?
MO won, he did.
By the way...
and what MO did afterwards. One of the great Indy traditions...
I know what you're going to say.
The winners are given a bottle of milk, which goes right back almost to the beginning, when one of the winners said, give me some buttermilk. And then after that, everybody had to do it. And then, of course, whatever the American version of the Milk Marketing Board is, took it over and it became a thing. But not Mo. For the first time ever, he was handed, at his own request, a bottle of orange juice.
Wasn't it his own brand?
It was. He had a citrus farm back in Brazil.
Yeah.
And he was quite unashamed about it. The interviewer said to him, how come you're not drinking milk? And he said, well, this is orange juice from my farm, my brand. And
he was vilified for it, wasn't he?
He was.
By purists.
Didn't go down well.
No. By the way, I'm great admirer of Emerson Fittipaldi, and I've written a book with him, and he's a lovely, lovely guy and a great driver. He was only ever called Emo when he got to the States, wasn't he? We didn't call him Emo in Formula One times.
That's true, and I'm talking about him at Indianapolis, and I'm calling him Emo.
Yeah, exactly. But nobody, you didn't...
no, he was Emerson.
He was Emerson. Yeah. Colin Chapman didn't call him Emo. But, when he got to the States, he did. I'm not knocking it. Anyway, there you are.
So that was... Anyway, it was good fun being at Indianapolis with Mansell. And I went back again the next year because he went back too, and he didn't have a very good time. He qualified way down the field, still with the... Neiman Haas team. And that time it was a Penske Alonso Jr. who won. And Nigel actually... Sorry. The race
that was the Merc engine car,
It was the Merc engine car. Yeah. Quite early in the second half of the race, the third quarter, Nigel was rear-ended during a yellow flag interlude, rear-ended by a guy called Dennis Vitolo, who just smashed his car up the rear of poor Nigel, who was blameless. And Vitolo's car, shouldn't laugh really, but nobody was hurt. Vitolo's car ended up on top of Nigel's on the infield stationary, and Nigel started getting out, and then a marshal arrived and pulled him out. And Nigel was never one to under-dramatise such events.
You could say
he
that.
Sort of collapsed into the arms of the marshal, and they rolled around on the grass. And Nigel eventually lay prone, and they had to send a stretcher for him. Very, very, very dramatic. It made up for a very undramatic race, I guess. He was fine.
I'm sure he was fine. Probably almost as painful as when his sock drawer fell on his big toe. Do you remember that?
I don't, but you're going to have to tell me.
His sock drawer fell on his big toe, and he was walking around, limping around the paddock, saying, "You couldn't believe the pain. You couldn't believe it." Anyway, so there you are. That's our Nigel, but a great driver.
I must say, one thing I remember from that second year, 94, was Fittipaldi crashed into the wall while ahead of, either ahead or just behind Alonso Jr., his teammate. Anyway, threatening to take the race from Little Al. And I remember he crashed into the wall, got out the car, and the grandstands erupted with glee because it meant an American was going to win again.
There you are. Homegrown hero.
Yep.
So Mansell won his... this is an interesting aside. Mansell won his Formula One world title in an Adrian Newey designed Williams. And it probably would be remiss of us not to mention Adrian Newey at all in this podcast, because, of course, he's most famous for being, well, arguably the greatest Formula One car designer of all time, or right up there. And he's also in the news quite a bit just now, obviously. But because we're talking about notable European exploits in the Indy 500, cars designed by Newey won at Indianapolis 3 years in a row. And who knows whether he'll have another go at the Indy 500 now that he's decided to leave Red Bull. No, I'm not predicting that, by the way, but you never know. Never say never.
Yeah, but he joined March, the car constructor, in 1981 and worked for them on F2 and sports car projects with great success. And then in 84, he moved to March's IndyCar program, where he worked as a race engineer for Bobby Rahal, who'd later head up the Jaguar F1 team, which, of course, became Red Bull Racing. Small world.
And that was the first time that team tried to hire him, because Bobby Rahal tried to hire him, but Ron Dennis managed to scupper it. Do you remember?
Yes, I do. You wanted him for Jaguar. Yes.
He did, indeed, yeah.
And one of those moments in which things might have turned out very different.
Very different.
For all concerned. But anyway, for the 1985 season, Adrian designed the March 85C, which ended up winning 10 of the 15 IndyCar races that year, including its second ever race, the Indy 500.
And that race was Danny Sullivan's famous spin and win victory. One of the most famous of all Indy 500 wins, when Danny did a full 360-degree spin while dicing with Mario Andretti, and not only managed to keep it out of the wall, by the way, but also recovered and later passed Mario to win. And here's another ANRAC fact, by the way. Danny Sullivan's Twitter, or X, handle is at spin2win85. And
Adrian's next car, the March 86C, would be even more successful, winning the 1986 and 87 Indy 500s. And he's not really stopped winning since, has he? You said maybe he's the most successful F1 car designer in history. I would say no doubt.
I think you'd have to say that.
Given his successes with Williams and McLaren and Red Bull. I mean, to go from team to team and do that is an astonishing achievement.
And I'm sure he's not done yet.
No, probably not. We also ought to mention, before we go, we must mention two other Brits who did extremely well at Indy. Two drivers, Dan Weldon, who won in 2005 and 2011, and then very sadly died not long after that second victory during an oval race elsewhere, not at Indy. And Dario Franchitti, who won in 2007 and 2010 and 2012, and was a real kind of master of Indianapolis.
He absolutely was, yeah. And that feels like a perfect time to say, and colossally, that's history.
Well, a huge thank you for joining us for this episode, which is episode 8 in our current run. And if you've enjoyed it and haven't listened to any of the others, we hope you'll check them out too.
Absolutely, we do hope that. And thank you for all of your messages on Twitter, X. It's great to hear your feedback, and we're so glad that so many of you appear to be enjoying the show. It really does mean an awful lot to us, not only to Richard and me, but to our producer, Johnny, and all the other people who make it possible. But remember, if you want to get in touch, you can reach us on podcasts at the-race.com or via social media. I'm at the Bichef1, and Richard is at rwilliams1947.
We'll be back to reappraise motor racing next week. But until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.
And colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.